Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. It's been a couple weeks since we've been here. Today, what I wanted to kind of focus on was the timelines in the purchase agreement and how we should be using notices to perform and demand to close escrow. Sometimes I think there is a bit of confusion when I have conversations with agents. They think that they can't send a demand to close escrow if they haven't already previously sent a notice to perform. So we're going to kind of talk about how the timelines work, when you can actually send and should send notices and the demands, and look at where those timelines are in the purchase agreement. So before I share my screen and we get started, does anybody have any questions? Remember, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat and I will get to you as soon as I see those. Otherwise, I guess let's get started. So you should be looking at, right now you're looking at the notice to perform, but what I think I want to do first is let's look at the purchase agreement first, and let's go to where the time periods are. Okay, so when we're writing the offer and we're looking at paragraph 3, there are a set of contingencies, the time periods that are in. And the defaulted time periods, we've gone over this a number of times, are 17 days for your loan, 17 days for appraisal, 17 days for investigation, 17 days for informational access. Now remember, informational access is separate from the actual contingencies. It just means that the buyer has access to the property for 17 days, even if they've removed all their contingencies prior to that. You have insurance for 17 days, review the seller's documents, review the preliminary title, review any leased or liened items, review any common interest disclosures. All that stuff is by default 17 days. They made them all the same a few years back. So when we're talking about the timelines for a buyer, when we're looking at notices to the buyer to perform, these are the timelines we're talking about. So they are, whatever changes we make, that's what affects the ability for us to send notices to perform in order to take the action of forcing the buyer to perform on those. One other time period where you can use notice to perform, where I skipped over, is the initial deposit amount, right? So we have 3 business days for the buyer to put their earnest money deposit into escrow, which is also an item, because it's a contractual obligation, that we can use if they aren't performing to send a notice to perform. Now, as for sellers, when we're looking at the timelines, the seller has these timelines. Delivery of documents. So everything that the seller is required to deliver has to be delivered in that first 7 days. Unless somehow it's changed, it has to be delivered in those 7 days. Both parties have to sign and return their escrow instructions within 5 days of receipt of those escrow instructions, which again creates an opportunity and a notice to perform. So if the seller hasn't signed and returned, or the buyer hasn't signed and returned, that gives us the opportunity to send them a notice to perform, to in effect give them a push into to performing those contractual obligations. The same with the install smoke detectors, evidence of representative authority. That goes for both parties also, right? So if a buyer is an entity, they're a trust, a partnership, or a corporation, then they have to provide those documents showing proof that they have the authority to sign within 3 days. I think a lot of times both buyer's agents and listing agents kind of ignore that that's required to be given to the other party, but it is. So you have to be prepared that at some point you're going to run into an agent on the other side that understands that you're required to provide that. And if you don't, then that could generate a notice to perform to get you to do that. Okay, so those are the time periods that are referenced in the purchase agreement that you can now use a notice to perform for, or a demand, and well, the demand would be used for this close of escrow period, obviously, because that's the only demand there is a demand to close of escrow. So whatever this is, that's how you would use the demand based on that time period. So those are all the time periods that we're going to talk about when we get into the notice and into the demand. Okay, so any questions about the time periods before I move into the other two forms? Okay, I'll take that as a no. No hands, no questions in the chat, so let's go. So here's the notice to buyer to perform. And obviously you see you can send more than one because it says notice to buyer to perform number, right? So if this is your first one, it would be number 1. Generally, these are all going to be attached to the purchase agreement, so you can leave them alone as far as that goes, unless you want, maybe if there is an amendment that is happening, some kind of a change, or the there is a request for repairs that is changing some timelines. Anything that might change the timelines, that document now becomes the document that is this notice to perform is working off of. So if you're just dealing still with the time periods from the original purchase agreement, you could leave this as a default at the top. If this notice to perform is subject to an amendment that you've created that changes some other kind of term of the purchase agreement, then I would make this notice to perform based on that amendment and what the date is of that amendment of existing agreement terms. Okay, property address, buyer's name, seller's names, very straightforward. When we look at this, it says seller hereby gives buyer notice to, as applicable, remove the specified contingencies and take the specified contractual action as follows. If for any contingency or contractual action selected, this NBP is delivered before the time permitted in this agreement, the notice shall be void for only those specific contingencies or contractual actions. But this NBP shall be valid for all other contingencies and contractual actions selected. If all contingencies are selected, this NBP shall be valid for all contingencies for which the delivery of this notice is within the time permitted in the agreement and void as to the others. So what it's basically saying there is there's a specific amount of time you have to be able to deliver. And what that time period is no more than 2 days prior to the contingency or the contractual obligation, right? So when we're looking at something, you have to think about the time periods for contractual obligations and contingencies. Contractual obligations are, the deposit is one of them that you have to provide some items within 3 days. The representative capacity, the authority to prove that's a contractual obligation. It's not a contingency. The escrow instructions is a contractual obligation, not a contingency. The seller providing all the documents, that's a contractual obligation, not a contingency. So when we look at these things, it's contractual obligations and contingencies. And this form is actually broken into those two different things. What we have to understand is that whatever the time period is on either of these two columns, the earliest point I can send a notice to buyer to perform is 2 days prior to that date. So for example, if the loan contingency is a 14-day contingency, I cannot send a notice to buyer to perform any earlier than day 14 after acceptance. Now, once we pass a date, I can send the notice to perform at any point I want, right? So once we get to day 14, let's say they didn't remove their contingency, on day 14, I can send notice to perform. And any day after that, I can send notice to perform. There's no requirement for me to send it within a specific amount of time other than prior to that action, okay? Let's see, we've got a question in the chat. If we reduce timeframes through a seller counteroffer, then on notice to perform, we put down seller counteroffer instead of purchase agreement. Okay, so whatever the timeframes are that you guys have negotiated, the rules still apply. It is 2 days for them to perform based on the notice to perform. and it cannot be sent sooner than 2 days prior to the contractual obligation or the contingency period. So let's say that you made your contingencies all 7 days. You wouldn't be able to send a notice to perform until day 5. And then you would have to wait until after day 7, right? So it's anywhere between 5 and 7. After day 5, you can send a notice to perform at any point, if that's what you've done. So you have to keep in mind, even if you've addressed the contingency periods, the period of the notice to perform doesn't change. Now you can, if you choose to, you could in a counteroffer, because the default of the notice to perform is 2 days for both buyer and seller. The contract used to have a space where you could change that. It no longer has it. It just says notice to perform are 2 days. I could, if I wanted to, I could change it to longer, or I could change it to a shorter period of time for notice to perform. The problem that you have to understand in that for those notices is it changes it for everybody, not just for the buyer. So if my seller's also not performing and I get a notice to perform, I would have the same amount of time. So I know what happens is that listing agents try to put more pressure on buyer's agents, which I think maybe is lessening a bit, except for I heard yesterday somebody said they got a counter offer saying that the buyer was going to remove their appraisal contingency. That acceptance. We're in a pretty balanced market now. You guys have got to learn how to negotiate better. But there's really no benefit in making that notice to perform period shorter. It doesn't make any sense, because then it puts pressure back on the seller also. If the seller doesn't perform something, let's say it's a Friday and they were supposed to give all their disclosures and they missed one, and they get a notice to perform that day on a Friday because they didn't do it, and it's a one-day thing, you could lose a buyer. And if we're moving into a more balanced market where you don't want to go back on the market because you're losing out on buyers, then that could be detrimental to your seller. So think about the condition of your transaction before you consider changing any of those time periods. I think the 2 days is plenty. It's a perfect amount of time to give people the opportunity to actually perform the obligation that they have. And if they don't, it's a perfect amount of time to say, well, you didn't do what you were supposed to. You had time to do it. We're going to, we have the right to cancel if we choose to. All right, we have another question here. Do you have to send a notice to perform after you open escrow and EMD was never wired after more than 3 days? As a matter of fact, yes, you do. It was one of the items we just talked about for contractual obligations, for contractual actions. So, yes, if a buyer fails to send in their deposit in that 3 business day period, or whatever period you have countered to change it to, because I see that people change it to 48 hours and 24 hours and all those things. If that is the case, then yes, in order for you to move on with another buyer, if you wanted to, you would have to send a notice to perform to them first, notice to buyer to perform, and then if they didn't perform based on the time periods of that NBP, then you would have the option to cancel if you chose to. So yes, any of the timeline, like if there's anything that you read in a contract that has a very specific amount of time for a buyer or seller to do something, then that constitutes the need for a notice to buyer to perform or a notice to seller to perform if they don't. Okay, so keep in mind, if I send a notice to perform and I've checked off all contingencies here, and I send it, and let's say that I send this notice to perform 3 days prior, right? I send it too early. I send it 3 days prior to the loan and the appraisal, but it is a proper time for the investigations. According to this document, it says, yeah, I can't force you to remove your appraisal and loan because it's not a valid notice to perform, but it is valid for your investigation period, which means you have to comply with the notice to perform, which would give me as seller, as listing agent, the right to cancel the transaction. So you have to keep in mind that just because it may be invalid for part, it is not invalid for all. Okay? So when you as buyer's agent receive that notice to remove all contingencies and it's not time for all of them, it's only time for one, and you don't remove that contingency, because in a contingency removal we have the opportunity to check off which we're going to do. If you don't remove that contingency, that seller would then have the right to terminate the transaction because you didn't perform based on this notice to perform. What if they never respond to the notice to perform? No, there is no requirement to respond to a notice to perform. As a matter of fact, as we go through this and you'll see the form, there's nothing that says the buyer has to acknowledge this. Okay? There's no requirement for the buyer to acknowledge it. It just has to be sent. So it doesn't matter if they respond to it or not. If they don't perform the way they're supposed to based on this notice, you'll have the obligation to cancel, or the opportunity to cancel, not the obligation, the opportunity to cancel. That's another thing when we talk about notices, and I hear this all the time, is I don't want to send a notice to perform because I don't want to cancel. Nothing requires you to cancel just because you said the notice to perform. It gives you the opportunity to, but nothing requires you to cancel. It doesn't mean that if I send you a notice to perform, automatically this deal is canceled. It doesn't mean that. The other thing is that, if I send you a notice to perform today, okay, and your performance date, now since this is a Thursday, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about. If I send you a notice to perform today, remember it is a 2-day notice to perform. Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays are not performance dates. So if I send it to you today, Saturday, based on the notice to perform, would be your performance date. But because it's a weekend, it moves to the next business day. Okay? So I send you notice to perform today. Saturday gets here, you don't have to perform. Sunday, you don't have to perform. On Monday, you have to perform. And when we look at performance dates based on this NBP, the time for the performance is 11:59 p.m. of the performance date. So it's not business days. It's not at 5 o'clock. It's not 48 hours from when I sent it to you. I hear that misconception a lot. It's like, I sent a notice to perform 48 hours ago. They have to remove their contingency right now at 3 o'clock. That's not true. It is 11:59 p.m. on the performance date. So if someone's performance date is today, they have until basically midnight tonight to send you that contingency removal or whatever other item you requested. If they don't at that point, then you would have the right starting the following day to be able to cancel. Okay? The other misconception is that if I don't cancel immediately after that 2-day period, I have to reset a notice to perform to do that. And that is not the case. We have double checked with CAR, and CAR said, once you send it, until that transaction closes, you can cancel based on that lack of performance. So if you are a buyer's agent and you get a notice to perform and the seller happens to not cancel after that performance date has come and gone, don't feel like, oh, they have to restart the whole process. It's not like evicting a tenant. I don't have to restart the process. I could cancel at any point. So you have to understand that as a buyer's agent or even as a seller, if I receive a notice to perform and fail to perform based on the criteria of that notice to perform, at any point after that, once my performance time has passed, at any point after that, they could cancel, which means I'm basically just standing on a ledge for the rest of the transaction, crossing my fingers and hoping. Okay? So the benefit of a notice to perform, and what I try to sell the benefit of a notice to perform to both buyer's agents and listing agents, is not the right to cancel. I mean, that helps. Obviously, having that flexibility, if someone's not performing, having that flexibility is a bonus. But it's not necessarily the most important thing about a notice to perform. What it shows, though, for you as an agent is you acting in a very professional manner, which is the other party isn't doing what they're supposed to. So on behalf of my client, I have now sent them paperwork compelling them to perform the duties that they agreed upon in the contract. But because we fear so much the notice to perform that it means we have to cancel or the deal's going to cancel, we don't do it. So there is no record anywhere, no true verifiable record that we're doing what we're supposed to do on behalf of our buyers or sellers. In the text, in the chat, if their contingency removal is due on Friday, we can send an NBP on Wednesday and it would be valid. That is correct. 2 days prior. So, for example, we talked about earlier, I said if you got a notice to perform today, that Saturday would be your performance date and that would move on to Monday. If today were my contingency period, was the date I was supposed to remove contingencies, I could have received a notice to perform or sent a notice to perform to my buyer or seller on Tuesday. And by today at 11:59, they'd have to perform. So, in the past, I've always had conversations about the ideas that if you guys want to stay on top of what's happening in your transactions, that instead of making contingencies automatically removed, be present and send notices to perform early. I'm not saying you have to cancel, but what it does is it gives you options. You don't have to wait around. You don't have to try to negotiate. You don't have to do extensions. You don't have to go through all it. You could do extensions if you want. I'm not saying don't, but what I mean is that you're not chasing somebody down. If I preemptively send notices to perform that are correctly sent, that 2 days prior, all it's doing is now giving me the option where I don't have to wait around if somebody is dragging their feet, if a buyer's not doing what they're supposed to. And like I said, the communication, it shows that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do on behalf of my client. I think that we've got to now get away from that fear of notices to perform, because it's going to show that we're taking action and that we're super professional in everything we do. So listing agents especially, you guys have to start maybe embracing the idea of notices to perform. And also keep in mind, if a deal's going to fall apart, most of the time, no matter what we try to do, it's going to fall apart. So what I want to do is I just want to show my seller that I'm doing everything I possibly can to keep this transaction moving forward. Now, going back to the time periods about when performance has to take place, remember I said Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays do not count as performance dates. They don't count as performance dates, but they count as days. So again, same example. Instead of Thursday, my contingency period, let's say, is going to be up on Monday, right? And I want to do that preemptive notice to perform. I can't send it yet because then that would make it invalid. But I can send it on Saturday. Even though it's not a performance date, it does count as a day. So if I send a notice to perform on Saturday, Saturday is day 0, Sunday is day 1, Monday is day 2. They have until Monday at 11:59 to perform. So you can send these notices to perform on weekends and on holidays, and those days will count. But they just don't, the other party is not forced to perform on those weekends or holidays. So I hope that's clear. I just understanding how those time periods work, because I think sometimes that's the biggest issue that I see on our side when maybe a listing agent does choose to use a notice to perform, is that they're delivered improperly and they become invalid because they're sending them too early. They're predated. I don't know how many times I have seen a transaction where an agent has their client sign a notice to perform when they sign disclosures and everything else. I don't know if they think it's because they're saving themselves some time or whatever the case is, but if that's the case and it's signed by a seller and it's signed 2 weeks prior to me sending it, that is not a valid notice to perform. So if there's anybody that's watching this video that's predating, like pre-signing notices to perform, don't do that. It's not correct way to do business. And you have to start to think about what that means for the look that you're giving your client, right? Like if you're telling your seller, hey, I don't know when I'm going to meet with you again, so I need you to sign a form that we may not even use, just so that we're ready to use it. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to me to have that conversation with a seller. So, hey, that's your business decision to try to do it. But what I would tell you is the chances are that's going to be an invalid notice to buyer to perform. So maybe you want to rethink that strategy. Okay. So let's look at the contingencies and the contractual obligations. So there's more contractual actions, right, than there are contingencies. So we talked about the initial deposit. If there's an increased deposit, there's a specific time for that. the liquidated damages clause with the increased deposit, those things have to be sent together. So maybe they only put the deposit in, but they didn't send the other forms. So you have to ask that. If they didn't send the lender information, what we're talking about there is that if they change the lender, the notice of the VA FHA requirements, verification of funds, it's usually with the offer, but sometimes the contract may be 3 days after acceptance. Same with the verification of loan application. The assumption of any leases or liens, paragraph AG, that's the leased or liened items that like solar panels or water softeners. The return of the statutory disclosures, because that has to be done by day 17. Return any of those things that have to be returned, documents that need to be returned. That's not a contingency. It's a document that has to be returned, and those time periods match with the contingency period. So keep that in mind. If they remove their contingencies but don't send those forms, you can still send them a notice to perform for that. Okay? So here is all your contractual obligations. On this side is your contingencies. So we have the loan contingency or all, like we checked here. We could say, hey, we're removing all. It's time. We're all past day 17. I'm sending you this right now to remove all contingencies. But let's say that maybe they've already removed a contingency or the contingencies are at different time periods. I can't do it that way. I have to pick and choose which ones I'm going to remove. Okay? So you got to keep in mind that let's fill it out properly. So let's, like in this case, let's say they haven't removed their appraisal is early, right? We've changed it to day 12 or something after inspections and or after acceptance, and maybe for their investigation periods, right? We changed that too. So we're going to pick those two and send that notice to perform. If you see here, it already says, if you do not remove the specified contingency with form CR or RR and take the specified contractual actions indicated above within no less than 2 days as specified in the agreement, days after delivery of this notice to buyer to perform, seller may cancel the agreement. So, unless you counter that it's going to be less than 2 days, it can't be less than 2 days. But I could make it more on this document. So my suggestion would be that if you're going to change it from anything other than 2 days, whether that be shorten it or lengthening it, I would address that first in your counteroffer at the very beginning. Okay? Because we don't want there to be any confusion about what the time periods they're going to have to be able to perform. Okay? That's it. So keep in mind, remember, that the most important things with the notice to perform, you cannot send it any sooner than 2 days prior to the contractual action or the contingency period. If you send it prior to that, it is invalid. There is no time limit on your right to cancel as seller on the notice to buyer to perform if the buyer doesn't perform. Okay, so you don't have to resend an NBP. And if a portion of the NBP is invalid, it doesn't affect the validity of the portion that is valid. Okay, so just because one portion may be invalid doesn't mean all of it is, and they would still have to perform. So understanding that stuff for the notices to perform is important for you guys, because I hear all the time where, oh, hey, I got a notice to perform and it's 1 day, and then we have to go look at it and say, okay, well, did they change it in the counter? No, they didn't, so this is invalid, right? And then we have to have that conversation. Or they're sending the notice to perform very early, so we have to have that conversation. Okay, so please just keep in mind that those are the most important things. 2 days prior to the obligation, any invalid portion does not invalidate all of it, and there is no timeline on the ability for the other party to cancel. Okay? Any questions before I move on to the seller's notice to seller to perform? No? All right. So looking at the notice to seller to perform, same thing, right? Which agreement is this attached to, whether it's the purchase agreement or it is some other amendment or something that we've done that this is tied to. The property address, the buyer's name, the seller's name. Seller's looks a little bit different because there are much fewer contingencies for the seller. than there are for the buyer, but there are contractual obligations. So the contractual actions is delivery of the information related to leased or liened items or systems, the statutory disclosures, okay, the lead disclosure, the fire hardening, the booklets and guides, the earthquake and the natural hazard booklet, any of the HOA documents that are required, the solar, the water safety, the WBC, my mind just went blank what it is. Any disclosure of material fact, including property claim or insurance claims, the preliminary title report, disclosure for the representative capacity, right? We talked about that. And then any inspection reports. Those inspection reports include the pre-sale inspection for the cities, right? So Southgate, Compton, any of those cities that have mandatory pre-sale inspection reports, those have to be delivered in the same amount of time as any other document that comes from the seller. If the seller fails to deliver those, then you have to send them a notice to seller to perform in order to give them the time, the notice that they need to deliver it. So all of these things are contractual obligations that you could use, and it's the same premise is it's 2 days. So if it's coming up on day 7 and you want to give that seller that early notice to perform, you have the right to do that, but you can't send it before day 5. On removal of their contingency, same thing. Whatever the contingency states, whatever you've negotiated in that SPRP, you have to live by those timelines. So you cannot send it sooner than 2 days prior. But once you do send it, you don't have to cancel after 2 days. You have the right to cancel whenever, as long as they fail to perform. Okay? So just like the buyers, if you do not take the contractual action specified above within no less than 2 days as specified in the agreement, days after delivery of this notice, the seller to perform, buyer may cancel the agreement. May cancel the agreement. Notwithstanding the previous sentence, if the contractual action is for the removal of abandoned personal property, seller shall be given at least 3 days to perform. Okay? It's fair. Right? Buyer signs, sends it to the seller. Again, just like the notice to buyer to perform, there's no requirement for the seller to acknowledge that they received this in order for it to be valid. Okay? So, again, I really, really want to stress to both buyer and sellers, buyers, agents and listing agents, it's important that we start to use these as a tool, because if we don't do it, what happens is we resist using it. Listing agents especially resist using it. Resist. And then we get to a point where it gets to be so much time that we have passed or we've wasted with the buyer, and then we choose to use it, right, by sending the notice to perform because we're fed up. And then it's time to cancel, and we're late in the transactions, right? Because generally what happens is notices to perform don't happen on day 17. They happen on day 21, 25, because people are upset, and we had a 30-day escrow period. So now what happens is the buyer ultimately ends up not performing, the seller ends up canceling, and they don't even have an opportunity to keep the buyer's deposit. And now you have a seller that is upset with you because we didn't do what we were supposed to. What happens is if we take actions as soon as we can in a transaction, so we send a notice to perform right away on day 17, or we send it early on day 15 just to say, hey, on this day you guys have to perform. If we do that and then the seller chooses not to cancel, now what's happened is we've put that on the seller. We've made the seller make that choice. And if the seller's choosing to not cancel, or the buyer's choosing to not cancel because they're not performing, then my suggestion is we send extension of time amendments, because I want everything to be in writing. So if I'm a listing agent and I'm advising my seller and I say, hey, it's day 17, they haven't removed any of their contingencies, here's a notice to perform I'd like you to sign. I'm going to send this to the buyer. Hopefully what this does is it gives them the nudge they need to take the action they're supposed to, and then we can continue on with this transaction. Okay? So I send it. They don't respond, right? They don't do what they're supposed to by day 17 or 2 days after we send the notice to buyer to perform. So then I go back to my seller and I say, seller, they didn't perform. You have two choices. We can continue moving forward with the transaction, or you have the right to cancel at this very moment. What would you like to do? Now, if the seller says, oh, I don't want to cancel. Yeah, we've only been in escrow for a couple weeks, right? So let's try moving forward. Okay, great. What we're going to do is we're going to give them an extension of time in writing to a specific date, right? Now, note, if I do that, would have to do, if they agree to that extension, I would have to send another notice to perform if they don't perform based on the extension. But what I want to do is I want there to be some level of proof that my seller told me to move forward. Now, if you don't want to do the extension, what you could do is send an email to your seller, require them to respond to you that says, we sent a notice to buyer to perform on this date. The buyer's performance date was this date. The buyer failed to perform. I've told you that your options are to continue with the transaction or to cancel. You've chosen to move forward with the transaction. Is this the correct, is this how our conversation went? Whatever it is, to get them to respond to you. Now that way the seller can't come back and say, well, why haven't we canceled and why don't we have their deposit and all those things? You asked me not to. Here's some proof. They can't come back. So those two things act both the same way. Is what it's trying to do is show proof that your seller is the one who instructed you to not cancel the transaction. Okay, so keep in mind that what happens is sellers and buyers, they get amnesia all the time, and they'll forget the direction they gave you if they feel like they were harmed in some way during the transaction. So we've got to not only protect them from themselves, but protect ourselves and the things that we do. And that's why I think using notices to perform, using extensions, making sure we're doing these email, verifying communication with each other via email is important, because that leaves a trail of your professionalism. Okay. One of the biggest complaints we have all the time is that from clients is that agents are horrible at communicating. This kind of thing during a transaction where you're really updating them throughout the transaction, this could help your level of communication and the connection you have with your client. I promise you, it's not going to hurt. It's going to help. Okay, so any questions about the notices to perform, either buyer or seller, before I move on to the demand to close? Anybody? No. Okay. All right. Let's look at the demand to close. So, notices to perform are for contractual actions and contingencies, not for close of escrow. There is one form for close of escrow, and that is demand to close escrow. That is the only thing you can use to compel somebody to close escrow and give you the opportunity to cancel if they don't. Okay, remember, you may have the right to cancel. You may cancel the agreement. Just like the notice to perform, same thing with the demand to close. The difference with the demand to close and the notice to perform, it is a 3-day demand, not 2. So, in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement or any amendments or anything else that you may have brought into place that this is attached to, when this is dated, whatever the date was, the property address, the buyer's names, the seller's names, the agreed upon close of escrow date, whatever that was, right? So whatever your original close of escrow date was, this is what we're going to put in there. That's the date that they're asking for. So they're asking for a date. So let's say that the close of escrow day was today, right? Today was close of escrow. And they're not going to close. We know when something's not going to close, right? They haven't signed docs yet, so it's not closing. They haven't funded yet. They signed docs yesterday. It didn't fund today. There's no specials where we're at, so it's not going to be able to record at the earliest until tomorrow, or they're signing docs today, whatever the case is. I want to make sure that I protect myself. Let's say that today was our close of escrow date and the buyer says, oh, they should be getting docs today. Okay. I don't believe them, because we've been, we had to chase them down for their contingencies. We used notices to perform, the whole thing. So now if I put in within 3 days of today, right, that I send it to them today, they would have until Monday to close escrow. So Friday's day 1, Saturday's day 2, Sunday's day 3. But because Sunday is a holiday or is a weekend, and obviously you can't close escrow on a weekend, it moves to Monday. If they don't close escrow on Monday, then on Tuesday I would have the right to cancel the agreement. You could even say on Monday night I have the right to do that, because close of escrow has to happen within business hours, right? You can't 11:59 p.m. close your escrow. Doesn't work, right? So if they haven't signed their docs and funded the loan and done all the things they need to do by Monday, then I would have the right to cancel. Doesn't mean I'd have to, but I'd have the right to cancel. So now let's say that our close of escrow date is actually on next Thursday, the 7th. Okay? Then what I would do is I would put this box here, or B, and I would put the date of August 7th. And as long as I sent it on August 4th, sorry, I didn't mean to change it. As long as I sent it on August 4th, I would have the right to do that. So just like the notices to perform, I can say 3 days prior to our agreed upon escrow closing, here is a demand to close. And if they don't close on time on August 7th, I would have the right to cancel come Thursday night, Friday morning. Okay? It can't be earlier than 3 days prior, though. It's not like I can send it to, hey, we're supposed to close escrow on the 15th of August. Here's a note. Here's a demand to close escrow right now. You have to close escrow on the 15th or cancel. It doesn't work like that. It would become invalid at that point. So this 1B is if I'm sending it prior to our close of escrow date. 1A is if I'm sending it after we were supposed to close. Make sense? So if you do not close escrow by the end of the time period specified in this demand to close escrow and seller has fully performed, seller may do any or some combination of the following: cancel the agreement, bring legal action against you for damages, including but not limited to the deposit, bring legal action against you to force you to buy the property. Specific performance. Specific performance goes both ways, right? Buyers can sue to have a seller force them to sell. Sellers could say, hey, I'm not going to cancel on you. I'm going to force you to close this escrow. That's very rare that something like that is happening, but you can do one of the two things. Like you could do two of them, right? Because I can cancel the agreement and I could go after you for any damages, right? I could try to go after you for damages. Now, if they haven't removed contingencies, the chances are you're not going to do that. So your really only option is to cancel. I mean, it would have to be something the buyer would have to do something pretty, bad in order for you to keep their deposit if they hadn't removed their contingencies. So try not to encourage your sellers to think that they're going to get the deposit if the contingencies haven't been removed. Try to keep that in mind. Please don't push that. Let's see. Can you repeat the last part about when to send? Okay, sure. If we are past our close of escrow date, right? Let's say our close of escrow date was yesterday, and I send them the demand to close escrow today, right? They have 3 days from today when they receive it to close escrow. So if I send it today, Friday would be day 1, Saturday would be day 2, Sunday would be day 3. Sunday, they can't close escrow, obviously. So by Monday, if they hadn't closed escrow, I would have the opportunity to cancel if I wanted to. Or if I'm sending it prior to a date, remember our close of escrow date is the 7th. I want them to close by the 7th, and I can send it on Monday, the 4th. I could send it 3 days prior to our agreed upon close of escrow date. And I can do this with any extensions. I can do any of that stuff. Now, if, for example, I use this one, right? I use the within 3 days because we're late on close of escrow. So it was supposed to close yesterday. I send them a demand to close. It didn't close. They contact me because I sent them the demand to close. They say, we need an extension until next Tuesday, right? So till the 5th of August. And we say, okay, send over the extension request. We're willing to grant it. If I do that and give them the extension, this demand is now invalid because we've changed the close of escrow date. This was based on a close of escrow date of 7/30. We just extended it to the 5th. So now we have a new close of escrow date. So guess what? If our close of escrow date is now August 5th, and I want to redo this whole thing, even though I've given them the extension, I would send them a new demand to close that would be for August 5th, which means I could send that to them on Saturday, right? Saturday is day 0, Sunday's day 1, Monday's day 2, Tuesday's day 3. If they don't close on August 5th based on the extension that we granted them, we would have the right to cancel. If I wait until August 5th, because that's our new day, and I don't send this to them prior to that, then I have to give them 3 days after August 5th to be able to close. Okay? I hope that made sense with the time periods. Everybody clear on those? Okay. So, again, I want all of you guys, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the share now, because we're going to finish a little bit early. I'll give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions. I want there to be a lot less fear surrounding notices to perform and demand to close, because I think it's an important tool for both sides. Again, for us, the most important thing that we can do is be professionals. Especially, look, you guys know that as this market shifts into this more balanced market where negotiating is important, and sellers are more willing to kind of give back a little bit to the buyers, and buyers are a little bit hesitant about the offers that they're making. They're really looking for the perfect home. So we're getting into that place where negotiations have to happen. And if we're going to do that, if that's the level of professional that we want to be, is that we're good at negotiations, part of that negotiation is going to be using notices to perform and demand to close escrows, and understanding how the time periods work, and using the proper forms, and doing things the way we're supposed to do them. That's the kind of stuff that's going to give your clients the faith in you to be able to get more referrals and have them want to do repeat business with you, and trust you when you give them, trust them when you give them advice. I think a lot of times we have pushback from our clients because, they're not quite sure that everything you say, right? So it's important for you to really, the promises that we make, right? We have to start under promising and over delivering, because for the majority of us, we over promise and under deliver. So I want you guys to embrace the idea that these documents exist for a really specific reason. They're good for you to show that you're doing the things that you're supposed to do on your client's behalf, and instead of having the fear that somehow it requires you to cancel a transaction, because it's not the truth. So that's all I have for these documents today. Did you guys have any questions about anything I can help you with, stuff you're struggling with, the obstacles that you're running into, or things that are making you feel a little nervous? Here we go. I got a couple things here in the text. Let's see, in the chat. Getting problems with the VP. Listing agents ignore when you request a copy of keys for mailbox. Some buyers' garage control remote keys attached. I have buyers where they need to pay. Any advice is very welcome. And in another class, that's okay. We don't have to do another class. The thing is with the final walkthrough is, remember, it is not a contingency, which means that if you go to the final walkthrough and repairs aren't completed, or items are damaged that weren't damaged when you wrote the offer, or like in this case, we're missing keys or garage remotes, or things that are necessary for us to enjoy the home, the only thing you have to do is request an extension of close of escrow in order for them to provide those items that are missing, or repair the things that are damaged, or the repairs that weren't completed. If they choose not to do that, now what happens is, just like we talked about earlier, where a seller says, I don't want to cancel based on the notice to perform, you've got to go back to your buyer and have your buyer instruct you on what to do. And you got to make sure that there's proof that the buyer said, it's okay, I don't care that I got those things, I'll pay for it, because you don't have the right to cancel. So what would happen would be is that I would do the final walkthrough. There's no keys, or let's do garage door openers. right? Because garage door openers are easier to replace a lot of times with the mailbox, and you can't just replace the lock. You have to get a new mailbox, or you have to, let's stick with the garage door openers. There's no garage door opener. So we say, hey, wait a minute. We did the walkthrough. We didn't see the garage door opener or whatever. And the seller says, hey, we need you guys to replace it. So we're going to send you an extension of time. We don't want to close escrow until you guys have a copy of it, right? Or get a new one. The seller says, absolutely not. Forget it. I'm not doing that. So now I go to my buyer and I say, okay, buyer, well, they're not going to give us the new garage door remote, even though they're supposed to. They choose not to. They're fighting us on it. What do you want to do? If we cancel, they could keep your deposit. It's going to cost you a couple $100 or whatever to get a new remote. Just let me know what you want to do. I need to make sure. So if we're going to go ahead and close that way, then please let me know. So I follow that up with an email, and the buyer says, yeah, whatever. We'll follow up. Now, they could go after the seller if they wanted to and sue them. If it's something more expensive, like it was a hole in the wall or they didn't complete a repair, or something was missing that was supposed to be there, and the seller refuses to replace it and extend the escrow to give them time to replace it. Or you guys agree in writing that the seller is going to replace it by a specific amount of time or repair it by a specific amount of time. The buyer's recourse at that point would be civil. They would have to go after the seller in small claims or something like that. So it's really, the walkthrough is just to verify that things are done. It doesn't necessarily mean that the seller is going to comply with everything that you've agreed upon. And then ultimately it becomes a civil dispute between buyer and seller. Let's see. Regarding the MVP, can you clarify how the timeline would work on weekends? If the contingent removal is due on a Saturday and you send the NBP on Friday, which would apply? Sunday to Monday cancel, or no. So what would happen? Their contingency, their performance day per the contract is Saturday. Right? Well, that's not a performance date. So automatically it kicks over to Monday, right? So that's the next business day. Unless Monday was a holiday of some kind, then it would move to Tuesday. But that doesn't stop the fact that I can send them a notice to perform today. So if their contingency removal, let's say, is on Saturday, I can send them a notice to perform today to say, hey, you have to perform on Saturday, but just that performance would roll over to Monday. Okay? So but if their performance date was Monday, contractually, I could send them a notice to perform on Saturday, and they'd still have to perform on Monday. It doesn't change. It doesn't change that. Okay. Let me see. I'll get to you in just a second, Angel. In case where someone sends MVP giving 1 day performance, but the RPA is supposed to be 2 minimum, does that delivered MVP default to 2 days to make it valid, or does a new correct one need to be resent? New correct one would need to be resent. Yeah, it would make it invalid, so they couldn't enforce it with you guys. All right, Angel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead. Let's see. There you go, Angel.
During the walkthrough, the final walkthrough, if the seller did not complete the agreed upon repairs, is extending the close of escrow the only option?
Well, it's not the only option. I mean, it's the best option. Right. So for example, I would say, Angel, you're the listing agent. Hey, we just did our walkthrough and you guys didn't finish the repair that we agreed upon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send you an extension of time request. How much time do you need to perform the repair to get it, to get it completed? Now, if the listing agent is compliant and says, yeah, it was a mistake, we screwed up, we need about a week. Okay, great. I'm going to extend escrow a week. And that's the best case scenario. Second thing is, listing agent says, you know what? The seller's bailed. They don't want to spend any more money. They're out. We're not going to be able to do that repair. So, you guys have to close. That's it. If that's the case, then you have to go again back to the buyer and say, hey, buyer, this is what they're going to do. What do you want to do? And then civilly, they could try to go after the seller. Or the buyer could cancel and put their deposit at risk if they chose to. I don't want to extend. I don't want this anymore. If they're not going to do that, I don't want to go through the civil matter of getting the repair done. They would have to. Okay. So those are really the three options.
Okay.
Or, seller could say, okay, we'll repair it afterwards. I mean, there's some others, like there's just multiple things, but it's not just like you got to take it. So the seller could say, hey, we had a contractor that was going to do it. They got tied up. They didn't finish it. So they're going to come back and finish it. Great. Okay, we're going to leave X amount of money in escrow payable to that contractor to make sure those repairs get completed. Right? You could, there's things that could happen. It's just, that's why it's important. Like when we look at the walkthrough,
Yeah.
when we look at the walkthrough, the thing with the walkthrough, the reason it's so important and the reason we want to do it 5 days prior is so that we have the ability to have those options. But when I know that, and I'm not talking to you guys here because you guys are great, fantastic agents, but I know that agents do their walkthrough after they've funded, sometimes the day they're recording. And now there's nothing I can do. So yeah, as long as we do it 5 days prior, there's a lot of options.
What would happen if the buyer says, you know what, it's too complicated. I want to cancel this deal. I don't want to deal with this anymore, or something.
Then you say, okay, but you have to understand that your deposit could be at risk, especially if they've removed contingencies. They're already at that point, So yeah, I mean, they could, and they just have to take that risk. But as long as you have something showing that you had that conversation, whether that be an email or something in writing that, hey, I'm informing you that you shouldn't cancel because you could lose your deposit, and they do it anyway, then that's on them, and they could go fight with the seller over the deposit.
So when the seller agreed to the repairs, is that and signed and agreed to the repairs, is that a contractual obligation on the seller's obligation?
Well, yeah. I mean, they're a breach of the agreement because they agreed to do those things, right? So that's why. But it would be a civil thing after the fact, and that's an easy civil case to prove. Is like, hey, they agreed to do it, they didn't do it, they forced us to close. That would be the argument from the buyer's end. And then civilly, it would depend on the cost of what that repair would be. If it fit under the $12,500 of small claims, then you go to small claims. If it doesn't, if it exceeds that $12,500, then you'd have to go through mediation, arbitration, or mediation and litigation, depending on what you guys agreed upon. Okay?
Thanks, Kyle.
You're welcome, Angel. Let's see. One last thing here. Could the buyer try and get a last-minute credit for the repairs rather than the seller do the repairs? If loan docs haven't been drawn already, yes, you could get a credit. But once the loan docs are drawn, you can't get a seller credit back to the buyer because then you'd have to redraw the docs. There's a redraw fee, all kinds of things. So it depends on, again, how soon you do that final walkthrough and any of the other credits. Like if there's a closing cost credit that was already agreed upon, the lender could still disallow that credit for those things. So it's possible. It's harder at that point because you generally already have the CD has gone out. You probably already have loan docs drawn up. They just haven't been signed. So it makes it a little bit more difficult for the credit. But that's why if there's somebody that's going to do the work, they could leave money behind payable to that person, and you'd be fine to do that. So, yeah, credits are possible, just not likely at that late in the escrow. Okay. I like that we had a little Q&A at the end there. I appreciate you guys contributing. Yeah, so that's it for today. Again, remember, please, if there's one thing you take away from this is NBPs, NSPs, and demands are your friends. Don't be afraid of them. They help you guys to be more professional and do the things you need to for your clients. So I appreciate you all being here. Remember, this video will be on YouTube a little bit later today. If you missed any part of it, you can watch it. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, please share, subscribe, get notification bell, right, so you know when the new videos are up. And I appreciate everybody that's watching and everybody that attended today. Thank you guys so much, and go out there, be productive, and be safe.